Little Goody Two Shoes is a video game by Astral Shift, published by Square-enix in 2023, available on Steam, Nintendo Switch, Sony PlayStation 5 and Microsoft Xbox Series S and X. Apparently it's not on the other 8th generation consoles aside from the Switch, which is weird. Anyway, before we talk about this game for real, I need to briefly bring up Astral Shift's previous horror adventure, Pocket Mirror, which Little Goody Two Shoes is a prequel to. Naturally, some people will wonder about play order. Generally, the best experience is had by playing games in release order. Of course, nobody follows that rule 100%. Anyway, the short and easy answer is that you can play these games in whatever order you like. But I also think that playing Pocket Mirror first works better. The more complicated answer is that Pocket Mirror is a game where majority of the gameplay consists of running between event flags, while having multiple endings and a somewhat fragmented narrative that has to be pieced together by the player. So at the same time it's not the most amazing game to replay, while most likely requiring at least 2 playthroughs from most players to properly appreciate. So my consensus is that if you're in a huge rush to play LGDS, you can just jump right into it, because it'll be better for you than rushing through Pocket Mirror and not appreciating and enjoying it for what it is. But if you got the time and will, do play Pocket Mirror first. Now enough about that. Let's return to LGDS, which I'd also describe as a horror adventure, as in an adventure game that has horror elements in it. I'm not here to strictly define what a horror game is, but to explain how I see this particular title, and what about it clicks and might not click. Little Goody Two Shoes is set in a fictional rural town of Kieferberg, in the mid-1800s Germany. You play as Elise, who was found as a baby in the nearby woods by old Holle, who adopts and raises her. Holle has passed now and Elise is alone, working odd jobs for the townspeople while not exactly being pleased by their disposition and tendencies, let alone how they treat her. Until one day she learns of a suspicious ritual to bring gifts to the woodland, which will in return fulfill any wish of hers. The idea of an easy and luxurious life away from Kieferberg's stuffy community pushes Elise partially past their suspicions, and she begins to pursue the ritual, while Kieferberg is plagued by strange events, and having to make sure nobody finds out what she's doing, lest they suspect her of witchcraft. And she'll also get to date one of 3 lovely girls while at it. Yes, this game is gay. Gameplay-wise, LGDS has a lot of variety. The game lasts from one Saturday to the next, each day being split into 6 periods. During the day you pursue the story of Kieferberg, talk to people in town, date girls, and work chores in arcade minigames, while nights are dedicated to horror segments where you explore the woods and solve puzzles. There are several survival resources to consider. Health is the most basic one, and mainly applies during horror segments, but there's also fullness, which is reduced when a time period changes, and must be restored with food items. There's sanity, which is reduced under specific circumstances, and can be restored with certain items. And then there's suspicion, which increases if you make the wrong choices during events where townspeople or specific characters question Elise's actions, but it can be reduced with the right choices. A full bar will lead to a dead end. This mashup of various resource systems can be exciting and engaging for some time. You can get some items as freebies, but if you need more, you'll have to buy them, which you need to spend money from work on. You don't really know what's ahead over the course of the game, so you'll probably try to prepare the best you can, and it'll feel like there's never really enough money. This is ludonarratively harmonious and engaging with Elise's poverty situation, and having to spend her days doing chores to get by. However, you will eventually learn what to expect and how to navigate the resource systems, to the point that it becomes almost completely trivialized. This will probably happen after your first playthrough, when you've already seen all of the horror segments, solved most puzzles, and know what to expect from the dialogue and events. There is apparent substance to the system, but then it turns into mere flavor. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can be a disappointment for some. Mostly this boils down to the game not being all that challenging. Difficulty is always deeply subjective, but with frequent save points, straightforward action segments, and the game being outright afraid of having you run out of resources, I think it's easier to argue that it's not very demanding to play, and these elements might not really be the main hook to look for. I've seen people have difficulties with some aspects of the game, like the work minigames, in which case they would have far less money to burn. so I think I have to take those other experiences into account. But what I said about the difficulty still applies for those who get good at the game, and it'll happen sooner or later. Suspicion interacts with food and money a little, since Muffy will tell on you to townspeople unless you give her food, so you can choose to keep suspicion low by sacrificing items. But there are also a lot of mandatory and optional dialogue scenes where you can reduce suspicion with the right answers. And even then you can avoid a lot of suspicion checkpoints by simply not talking to townspeople. But I recommend you look for as much dialogue in the game as possible if you want more out of it. More on that later. Suspicion checkpoints are always a choice between two answers, and even someone as socially unskilled as I can get them right most of the time. Again, not necessarily much as substance, but good enough as flavor. The minigames were made to be fun, and that's definitely a success. There's 4 of them, mainly testing the player's perception and timing skills. The higher your score, the better you rank, and your rank determines the pay, so playing well means more money, so you can fill Elise's pockets with bread and whatever else you might need or want. Elise herself doesn't really supposedly enjoy these chores, but they're still presented in a fun manner to the player. From a developer interview I know they did this to make replays more enjoyable, as before the minigames were created, they meant to have the player answer riddles instead, which they supposedly didn't find to flow as well during replays. I guess it still at least adds a narrative layer that presents Elise as underappreciative and lazy. I at least find chopping wood in real life to be really fun, even if it doesn't involve kicking goats and anvils out of the way. I'll never say no to a good wood chopping minigame either. All the minigames function and control fairly well, but you might find the egg collection one to be a little clumsy. But I think it's probably by design. Turning and moving is fairly slow, and I suppose it would be trivial to play if movement was too smooth, while making it faster and more frantic would probably make it too difficult to handle for some players, so the slower movement is probably a compromise. Kiss the Rat is something I found the toughest. There's almost zero room for error if you want a high rank, while in some of the other minigames you can mess up a couple of times and still get an S rank. The puzzles in the whole segments are pretty simple, but there's a lot of creativity involved, and they're also well tied with the aesthetics of the environments you explore. I particularly like how the concepts of some puzzles are sort of reversed in the last segments of an area, to add a bit more length, without making it too repetitive. There are some cheap parts and even instant deaths, so most players are bound to feel some frustration, but there's frequent chances to save, so you'll never lose much progress if you die, for better or worse. One of the strongest factors in making me keep replaying the game, besides hunting down events and dialogue, was all the little secrets and mysteries going on. I wanted to find everything and just solve the entire game in terms of content and mechanics. If you're allured by the idea of checking online for things when you run into a dead end, try to hold back there. It's not too difficult to find everything by yourself, and it's very satisfying to explore and solve the game as a whole. Unfortunately, Little Goody Two-Shoes has its share of technical issues. I mostly adapted decently to the controls, but I've seen enough complaints about them that I can't not mention it. The game uses 8-directional control regardless of what control device you use, and sometimes interacting with items and NPCs can be difficult. You'll sometimes try to interact with people and objects only for the window for doing so disappearing right in front of your face, as you shuffle left and right, trying to make it appear again. Sometimes the radius for interacting with an entity can feel ridiculously small to the point that one step is enough to pass it, and sometimes it's so large it disturbs your attempt to interact with something completely different. It would be helpful if the game supported mouse control and had 360-degree movement on controller sticks, and had actual input sensitivity and the option to change it. The control settings are also weird because with the modern and classic controls on a controller, barely anything changes and the menu doesn't even seem to display the changes properly. On keyboard, all that changes is movement swapping between WASD and the arrow keys, and Z and X becoming available as cancel and confirm keys. I mostly played on keyboard, but I did do some testing with the controller, and it seems to have a small technical advantage. It's a little easier to make small changes in Elise's position with the stick, and there's noticeably less input delay with the controller. Weird thing with the controller is that you need to have one with the stick. The D-pad doesn't support movement in any way, and it's reserved only for menus, and the party dial command is bound to D-pad right. I think it would be more valuable to have the D-pad as a control option for those who prefer it. Especially if you have to get rid of one menu shortcut or something to fit party dial elsewhere. Or better yet, just let us customize the controls in-game, which is the convenience everyone expects. There's also an aesthetic blemish in the controls, in that there's a lot of diagonal hallways in the game, and Elise's diagonal movement barely ever aligns with it. Moving between the benches in the church is a good example of this. You have to awkwardly zigzag between them, and simply holding an angle doesn't quite cut it. I don't think this is a big deal, but there's some weirdly inconsistent input delay in various menus, and it definitely isn't transition animations causing trouble with the interaction. I didn't experience this on a controller though. Another inconsistency is that while there's a skip feature for most events and dialogue, it doesn't work for everything for some reason. So you may sometimes run into situations where you die and then have to go through dialogue with the pace of your spacebar, because fast forwarding just doesn't do anything. My wildest assumption is that there are some animations during the event scenes that will break with fast forward and they didn't manage to fix it, so disabling fast forward for select events was the best choice. But yeah, I don't have any proof, so it will remain as an assumption. My setup is a meme, so my CPU hit the limit a few times, and the game crashed my entire OS while I tried to alt-tab. If your rig isn't very good, try to be wary of this at least during events with lots of NPCs and objects on the screen, though it did happen to me once during even the end credits. Despite how the game appears, I sometimes saw it take over 2 whole gigs of RAM, so make sure you've got a modern amount of memory or you will probably run into problems. There's also some bugs reported by players, but since they are reported, they can maybe be fixed someday. I'm not sure how prominent any of these issues are, since I didn't really run into most of them. I only really had trouble with crashing. I did run into a couple of logs where interacting with something left Elise stuck trying to move towards it, but those could be easily solved by rebooting the game and loading my last save. Save often, you lose nothing, and if you run out of the 20 slots the game has, you can just pack them up somewhere and start another row. As a small bridge into better things, the game has a dialogue backlog, which is definitely welcome. So if you accidentally skip something or need to check back on a line, like a hint in a puzzle, it's easy to do, although scrolling is kinda slow. I generally have a problem with most horror in that I don't really find it scary or distressing. This isn't me trying to brag about how tough a guy I am or something. I think it's more of an emotional handicap of mine. Anyway, I think I can still tell that the general subject of the horror in LGDS isn't all that unsettling, with some exceptions. But despite that, thanks to the great characterization and visuals, it's still easy to view every place and situation in the game as immersive, as if it was actually happening despite being fiction. You can empathize with Elise's struggle and wish she didn't have to go through with this shit. In Pocket Mirror I often saw a lot of the horror elements as a little random, but what they've got in Little Goody Two Shoes feels more meaningful. There's more to read into and a more consistent symbolic and thematic whole. Unfortunately I'm a dumbass, so I can't give you any deep analysis about what's going on here. You'll need a smarter guy for that. You might be wondering, what kind of review is this? You need to get an idea of how scary this game actually is. What if it's too scary for you and you can't handle it? From my perspective, I think you're lucky. If it's too scary for you, you get to feel intense emotions when you play it. You never know when you begin to lose that, so you should rejoice in your dread while you still can. But yes indeed, the visuals definitely make the game stand out. The 90s shoujo anime inspired designs and art look fantastic, and the graphics look like turn of the millennium 2D JRPGs didn't go anywhere. All of the environment has beautiful detail to it. Despite how Elise feels, most people would love to live in a town that looks like this. It's also impressive how they put effort into Kieferberg during different weather and time. Everything pairs well with the standout music and sound to create a powerful ambience, whether you're walking through a windy night or a peaceful Sunday dawn. By the way, the soundtrack is available on Steam too, and it's definitely worth it. I did get it as a pre-order bonus, but if I didn't, I'd gladly buy it. It's a great thing to have, especially when a lot of other companies don't seem too interested in releasing their soundtracks beyond streaming sites. I wanna put that stuff in my music player and blast it in my car while driving back home from who knows where after midnight. And if I can just buy it digitally, that's a huge service compared to imported CDs from Japan or the US. Or in a recent case, having to buy the damn vinyl release, because there's nothing else as far as I can find. Roughly 60 tracks of music that perfectly fits every scenario. Since you spend a lot of time in town talking to people, having different variations of the town music for different times of the day is also welcome. I like the town music at dusk a lot myself. The arcade minigames have their own gamey tune going on. There's even vocal tracks for specific moments in the story, some of which are sung by the voice actors themselves. Atmospheric music with distinct and memorable motifs all around. This soundtrack definitely deserves more attention and recognition. The story is definitely the main motivator in the game, and it's what helped me sit through 4 playthroughs to see every event I could. The narrative is character driven, there's various endings that you can get depending on your choices. Some are glorified dead ends, some are just absolutely horrible in other ways, but if you want a happy resolution, you can get that too. Only one of the endings lead to the events of Pocket Mirror, and you'll know it when you see it. There's some pretty heavy foreshadowing for some of the bigger twists. I don't know if there's a name for this or not, but I think LGDS relies on this effect where you know something is going to happen, but you try to convince yourself it won't. That anticipation helps make some of the story routes pretty impactful. While I do say routes, most of what differs in the actual story is backloaded to the very end of the game, so don't expect any wild differences in the narrative on replays, aside from who you choose as Elise's sweetheart. I already said it before, but you should try to hunt down as much dialogue with the NPCs as possible. Majority of what the folk of Kieferberg have to say are mundane worries about their mundane little lives, but mixed in are some details about their livelihoods and relations. The game doesn't have any glossary with biographies of who's who, which I found a little weird at first, but then I figured it's actually interesting to try to piece together who's family or close with who, what they think of each other, their personalities and so on. Some of the NPCs blurred together for me, mostly because I have issues with remembering not only names, but faces too. And not even close to every character in the game has a large dialogue sprite to help with that. It's a neat touch how after dialogue is exhausted with an NPC or a group of them, Elise will think of something simple about it to herself as a shorter line to scroll through, without any unorganic UI indicators to show there's no more dialogue, which would mess with the visual image too much. Just a short monologue box for some flavor, but also to indicate that there's nothing more to hear at this moment. If there's a theme to this game that I can actually infer, it's a question of what fortune even really is. It's a rather clear-cut theme, but seeing it expressed through the various characters and endings offers some food for thought. Elise works a lot, but her attitude is lazy. She's unappreciative, disrespectful, and impatient. This may make her sound like a bad person, but she really isn't. Her willful personality also makes her proactive, brave, and direct. She isn't evil and she isn't cruel, and she can definitely be good to people when she doesn't feel like she's been mistreated first. She's an extremely humane character, and despite all her shortcomings, I can't see anyone truly disliking her as a character or as a person. No matter what choices you make in the story, she's never completely selfish. While she is the eponymous little Goody Two-Shoes, a synonym for a hypocrite, she isn't the only one like that in Kieferberg. There are no perfect people in this village. Everyone's trying to pursue and take care of their peace of mind and well-being the best they can, but like the humans they are, they don't do it perfectly and can be more or less misguided and clumsy about it. A lot of people probably view Father Hans, the local priest, as a preachy, self-important asshat. His faith and belief are a double-edged sword. Positively it helps with unifying the folk and to help with order and stability, but he's also blinded by it, and some of the things he says and does to keep things running well aren't really helping his cause. Most people will definitely hate old Johan. He's constantly on Elise's or someone else's case accusing them of witchcraft, but even old Johan means well. He wants everyone to be safe and at peace, but goes about it in an accusatory, superstitious and fearful manner. Muffy is a girl who's practically stalking Elise to dig dirt on her, so she can threaten to tell on the villagers about her, and asks Elisa to give her food as a bribe to give her mouth shut. Muffy might seem like an exploitative little rascal, but she's apparently got a rough time at home, living with her aunt, who throws chores at her like she was Cinderella. It's not possible to truly tell whether Muffy is just being lazy, or if she's actually being treated differently for not being an immediate blood relative. But maybe eating tasty stuff is one of her few comforts. The situation seems like a different flavor of what Elisa has been through, and I think that despite how she acts, she's still pretty easy to sympathize with. Gustav, Freya's father and the mayor of the town, is one of the few characters who's easy to view in a more positive light. He's more tolerating and liberal than many modern people would be, but whenever he's taking Elisa's side or being lax about the situation of Kieferberg, you do know for a fact that he's been too trusting and too careless, so even his positive qualities have a negative side to them. But his attitude also keeps people at ease in the moment and prevents them from hurting each other. Those are just some examples of the different characters and their portrayals. The game doesn't really stress this duality, it's more something the player has to judge for themselves, and I think that's beautiful about the design of the narrative, whether it's intentional or not. I can relate with Elisa's view on the community of Kieferberg. I myself live in a small town where most people know each other, and besides their daily work don't have any actual hobbies, besides talking shit about each other. But I can also see the value of a tightly knit community, when it's not jumping out of its shoes. And there's fortune in being able to live with such a community, so the idea of just leaving it behind isn't an objectively ideal solution either. In recent years I've begun to appreciate this sort of character writing, where people's qualities are shown to have positive and negative consequences, and aren't strictly just good and bad sides of their personality, where they must get rid of one and cultivate the other more. It's more a matter of how people conduct themselves that makes a difference between so-called good nature and bad nature. The vast majority of NPCs don't really have any particular character arc going on, which can maybe be disappointing after how much I've been praising the story and characters. But I suppose it makes sense that the people who aren't looking for any actual change and simply want to uphold the status quo of their lives aren't seeing any change, no arc, they just live on as they are. However, whoever you have Elisa date between the three girls gets an actual arc. It's apparently possible to date more than one in a playthrough, and still get their respective endings, with some saves coming involved. But a lot of the date events are set at the same time, so I recommend you dedicate one playthrough to each girl to see all their date events. All the events are super cute too, so that's another reason for you to check them all out. The dialogue and character interaction is very spontaneous and well written. There's great chemistry between Elisa and her girlfriends, and whichever pairing you pick, they learn from each other and fulfill each other. Just really goddamn great romance going on here. The character interaction and development between the pair also matches the theme of fortune I mentioned earlier, and the romance plot is directly involved with the main story, and most of the endings you can get. It isn't just a fun extra thing to have, but a core part of the game's narrative. I suppose I have to talk a little about each girl, since it can encourage some to actually play the game. Rosemarine is a wanderer. Elisa isn't already her friend at the start of the game, so she's a bit of a mystery. She seems kind of like an airhead who's got her head in not the clouds but all the way up in the stars. Believes in fate and fortune telling and is well in touch with nature. Her outlook on life is a direct opposite of Elisa's more secular, immediate and practical way of thinking, and that contrast between them is so strong that when their qualities rub off on one another, it leaves a really strong impression. This makes them my favorite pair in the game. Plus, she cooks and cleans for Elisa, so if I was Elisa I'd probably want to marry her at that point. Lepkuchen is Elisa's bestie. They've gotten along since childhood. She's a clergywoman, but the way religion is, they can also arguably be gay, so it shouldn't be a problem. Lepkuchen gives Elisa bread every evening, so if I was Elisa I'd probably want to marry her at that point. Anyway, Lep is a fun mix of playful and serious, while also having a delightful sadism mode. She's constantly trying to get a read on Elisa's mind, while scolding her for the trouble she gets herself in, just because she cares so much. It's damn heartwarming. Freya is the local trad wife. She's really strong and skilled in all kinds of work, so if I was Elisa I'd probably want to marry her. Lepkuchen and Freya both have a bit of a hidden side to their characters that isn't really apparent without seeing their date events. For me it's difficult to talk about Freya much without bringing that up, but I prefer for the 2.5 people watching the whole length of this video to go into the game as blind as possible. It's not a huge feast or anything, but curiosity is a fun emotion, and I don't want to rob it away from anyone. Freya is just really precious. I love how she and Elisa are practically competing about taking care of each other. One neat touch related to the romancing is how talking to Elisa's respective sweetheart at certain points triggers non-standard dialogue that takes the subplot into account, even if it's nothing particularly important. Many games that incorporate dating stuff tend to leave those events inside their own vacuum, so simply swapping event flags here and there to make two characters acknowledge that they spent time together somewhere, or just mention something they talked about, or even remind each other that they've got a date set later, it just makes it feel more organic, and destroys that vacuum effect completely. Little Goody Two Shoes is sometimes awkward as a game in terms of design, but it's a fantastic interactive narrative and a feast for your eyes and ears both, so I can't recommend it enough, as long as you can deal with its quirks. I've said some things about Pocket Mirror in this video that may make it sound like a shaky work, and while it's not an ideal game, it's got a really strong narrative and artistic realization that I keep thinking about more than I expected to. Little Goody Two Shoes shows how Astral Shift has improved in every way, and also manages to leave a lasting impression that's impossible to shake away even if you wanted to. Whatever weaknesses these works have as games, in terms of presentation and narrative, they're still powerhouses. Whatever Astral Shift makes next, I hope they can improve on their weak points and keep up with what they're great at. I'm gonna be there when they're done cooking.